As the 2-year anniversary of the Rogers triple homicide approached, the task force felt renewed pressure to solve the case. They had an FBI profile describing the characteristics of the man who had committed the horrible crime. But would the FBI profile get them any closer to catching the killer? The profile showed that the killer probably lived in the Tampa Bay area, owned his own boat, and lived a seemingly normal life. Somewhere, someone would know him. The FBI's recommendation? Use the media to flush him out.
The traditional way for law enforcement, especially homicide, is we don't talk. We don't tell very much. So, with that FBI statement, I took that to heart, because he said the only way you're going to find out who did this is somebody from the community's got to tell you.
Sergeant Moore called a press conference shortly after we got back from Quantico, and a lot of press showed up. There was a table set up with a map behind Sergeant Moore of the victim's itinerary, and Sergeant Moore gave a lot of information to the press.
Was there any fear on your part that the media exposure could backfire?
Well, I released way too much information. The media actually couldn't handle it. They didn't use a lot of it. I learned on that first time not to give it all out.
Thousands of people saw Sergeant Moore's news conference or read about it in the newspaper. One of them was Tampa resident Joanne Steffi. Like so many others, Joanne Steffi and her daughter Cindy Hopper had been following the case since the beginning. But there was one major difference. Joanne believed she knew the killer. Steffi lived just off Tampa Bay. At the time of the murders, her neighbor 2 doors down was an avid boater and a familiar face in the neighborhood. His name was Oba Chandler.
I didn't like him from the first time I ever met him. He gave me the willies.
Everybody thought he was a great guy. You know, that he was fun and interesting and charming. But Mom always had this feeling about this guy.
The hair on the back of my neck stood up the first time I ever met him. And I've never had that happen before or since. I just sensed it.
When police originally released the composite sketch of the Rogers killer, Joanne clipped it from the newspaper and hung it on her refrigerator. A few days later, she drove past Chandler's house while he was working in the yard.
I turned and looked and said, "Oh my God, it's him." To me, it looked just like him. There was no question.
The more she learned, the more convinced she became. The killer had a blue and white boat. So did Oba Chandler.
He had a boat just like it. And where the house is located, you go out the back door, you jump in the boat, you go 15 minutes out the canal and around the corner, and now you're on the causeway right there where the car was found. It was just an awful lot of coincidence to be a coincidence.
Joanne Steffi wanted to go to the police, but she was afraid of what might happen if Chandler was the killer, and somehow found out she had turned him in.
It's like, you know, every knock on the door or every bump in the night, you're thinking that this crazy man could be coming after you to shut you up.
Joanne Steffi says she confided in a deputy sheriff she met in night school. She told him all about her neighbor and the boat he used to own. After that, Joanne never heard from anyone in law enforcement. She could only assume Chandler had been investigated and cleared. Then, a few months after the sketch was published, Oba Chandler packed up his wife and daughter and abruptly moved out.
I don't believe the house was sold. I think they just left.
With Chandler gone, Joanne tried to put the case out of her mind. But when she read about Sergeant Moore's news conference, it all came rushing back. She worried that the man police were looking for, the man whose sketch was still taped to her refrigerator, was her old neighbor, Oba Chandler. Sergeant Moore's team had never heard about Joanne Steffi's suspicious neighbor. Her information never reached the task force. But they believed they already had a lead that would move the investigation forward. The brochure they had found in Roger's car held an important clue. Why was that brochure that was found in the car the key to solving it?
Handwriting was found on that brochure. That's what we were looking for, something like that, to get us to the next step.
Handwriting analysis revealed the directions on the brochure were distinctive. The author had 3 unique ways of terminating his Y's, and an unusual habit of following a lowercase r with a capital T in the middle of a word. It was valuable evidence, exactly the kind of information police usually kept to themselves. But Sergeant Moore was under mounting pressure from his bosses to solve the case or shelve it.
We finally came to the point where, listen, we got no other choices. Let's do something bold and release this handwriting and tell the public, if you can tell us who wrote this, you've found the killer.
Reproductions of the handwriting ran in every local paper. Across the bay in Tampa, Joanne Steffi cut out the article. Her mind was racing. Was there something she could do to confirm her suspicions?
He was an aluminum contractor. He does screen enclosures for pools and whatnot, and the people that lived next door had hired him to do some work.
Joanne asked her neighbors to look for anything they might have with Chandler's handwriting on it. After hours of digging through her files, they found the contract he had written up for their job.
I matched it up to the one from the paper. And I just held him up, and my knees buckled. And he said, "Oh my God, it is him."
Coming up, the case gets personal for the detective in charge. You actually staked your career on this, didn't you?
We had to find this guy, and my career didn't matter, and I was going to do what it took to get it done.